money, I want it now. Well, it's my life, and I want my dreams now. And the problem is that oftentimes God is telling us to be patient for very important reasons. And David had to learn that lesson as well. See, we know from the last few weeks of our study of David that David was anointed by Solomon. By Samuel. That would have been fun. David was anointed by Samuel to be the next king over all of Israel, to be God's chosen man. Soon after, David fought Goliath and stood up as one man with an army of Israelites cowering behind and an army of Philistines rejoicing, expecting victory. David stood in the gap and declared to that giant that he was going to die. And then with the power of God, David defeated the giant. And everything was looking great for David. After that, they threw parades in his honor. Literally, women would grab their tambourines and march before him as he walked through the towns, throwing flowers as they went. And his fame grew as David, the giant killer, the boy who was touched by God. Then he met Jonathan. And Jonathan is one of those people in the Bible where I feel like we don't know nearly enough about him. He seems like an incredible man of God who was actually next in line to be king after King Saul. When Saul died, Jonathan should have taken the throne. And Jonathan, knowing this, still sees life in David. And we know that Jonathan goes and grabs David and makes him a friend who he teaches and trains. He teaches him in the ways of war. Now, David was a man who Saul felt threatened by. We know this from passages where Saul is talking to David or watching David play the harp, and he takes a spear and throws it at David just out of anger. Saul decides that David is a threat and that the people might like David more than Saul. So Saul begins to decide that David needs to die. And so Saul gives David commanding over a body of armed forces, not to give him promotion, but to put him in a position where he could die. He gave him soldiers and sent him to march into the deepest battles, but God gave David the victory. So that wasn't enough. So Saul had David marry his daughter, Michal. And Michal it wasn't just to make David prince. It was this idea that if he is a prince now, then the enemy will really want to kill him. So he had David marry his daughter, the princess, and then send him into battle again. But again, David found victory. Because a man of God or a woman of God that is walking in the power of God is unstoppable. And then the greater enemies and the greater problems only become greater testimonies. The bigger threat becomes the greater victory. So you have David, who continues to grow in fame. People begin to chant his names. They walk through the streets in these parades saying, Saul has killed thousands of men, but David has killed 10,000s. And Saul hears this and decides that David needs to die. And my question to you this morning is, what do you do when you see somebody else who is the hand of God in their life? What do you do when you see God moving in somebody else's life, but he doesn't seem to be moving in yours? What do you do when that other person gets the promotion, that other person gets the healing, that other person gets the dream relationship or the dream car or the dream job, and you are sitting there like, God, what about me? See, we see Saul and Jonathan, two men who had the same, were threatened in the same way by David. Where David was called to be the king, not Jonathan, not Saul. David was called to be the king, and Jonathan adopted him as a spiritual friend, as a spiritual son, while Saul conspired against him. The problem didn't change. The person didn't change. All that changed was their attitude. When you see somebody else and God is moving in their life, do you begin to start comparing your abilities and your fame and their popularity to theirs? Do you begin to jealously wish that something bad would happen to them? Or do you sit there like Jonathan and say, this isn't about me. It's not even about David. It's about the will of God, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. But so Saul decides that David needs to die, and Michal hides in David's bedroom and takes some pillows and wraps it up in a blanket, just like you did when you were a teenager to fool your parents. And she puts some goat's hair on the head, just like you did when you were a kid to fool your parents. Everybody had goat hair, right? That wasn't just me. And the soldiers come to arrest David and find out that he's not there. And then Jonathan goes to David and tells David, you got to run. My dad's going to kill you. You better go. And David covers Jonathan covers for David at Saul's palace. So Saul's own children are now conspiring against him to help David. And the next thing that David does is he goes to the tabernacle, the place of God, where the people of God live, and he can get direction, he can get help. And he goes there, and they give him some bread from the tabernacle. And when he runs away, Saul comes after with his army and literally kills all 40 of the priests in the tabernacle. The jealousy of this man is destroying everything that he was supposed to be building. So David runs away. And that's where we pick up David's story today, in 1 Samuel chapter 22, starting at verse 1. The title of my sermon this morning is Patient for the Promise. Verse 1 of chapter 22 says, David departed from there, from the tabernacle, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now, I want you to understand here that David has now, in just a short amount of time, gone from the kingdom to the cave. He's gone from being famous to being a fugitive. He's gone from being the prince to public enemy number one. David has gone from God had given him everything, and now everything was taken away. Anybody ever have moments like this in their life where it seemed like things were going well, God was working in my life, and now everything is gone? What happened, God? And now David is sitting in the cave of Adullam. And most scholars believe that it was at this time that David wrote Psalms 142. So I want to read that for you this morning. I want you to picture David sitting in this cave, alone, afraid, literally on the run, not understanding what's going on. And Psalm 142 says this. It says, I cry out to the Lord. I plead for the Lord's mercy. I pour out my complaints before him and tell him all my troubles. When I am overwhelmed, you alone know the way I should turn. Wherever I go, my enemies have set traps for me. I look for somebody to come and help, but no one gives me a passing thought. No one will help me. No one cares a bit what happens to me. Can you picture David sitting in that cave saying, God, what happened? God, why is this happening to me? I was called and I faced Goliath. I did everything right. And then when Saul wanted to kill me, I played my harp and I set them free from the spirits that were attacking him. God, I honored the man. And now he's out to kill me. I've lost my best friend. I've lost my wife. I've lost my position. I've lost everything. And now I'm a fugitive. The people that I was supposed to lead are now hunting me. God, I thought you had plans. He says, no matter where I go, God, there's set traps for me. Everybody who helped me died. And nobody else will even give me a passing thought. I'm sitting here in the cave alone. Now we have to understand, though, that this part where David, the future king, is sitting in the cave is probably one of the most crucial moments of David's life. And it might be one of the most crucial moments of yours. See, what God did here was he took David back to the pasture. You remember where God found David? David had nothing. David was sitting with the sheep. You all remember that. Sheep, grass, poop, every day, the mundane, the nothing, being alone. When Samuel came to town, the father didn't even invite David because he wasn't important enough to come and see the prophet. And now, David had some fame. He had some parades. He had some victories. He had some soldiers. He had robes put on him. He learned how to fight. And then God said, hold up. 1 second, that's not who I called. I didn't call the warrior. I didn't call the famous person. I called the shepherd boy. He says, look, they threw you parades and parties. I threw you lions and bears. They taught you how to use swords and bows. I taught you how to use a harp, which was the real weapon that you used against the forces of darkness. He said, everything that I did was for you. He says, I didn't put a victor's crown on your head. I put anointing oil on your head. There's a part of this where we have to understand that God is going to do great things in your life, but at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that pasture period, is your moment with God, your intimacy with God. God says, look, I didn't give you to the kingdom. You don't belong to your ministry. You don't belong to your job. You don't even belong to your family. You don't even belong to you. He says, you belong to me. And I think that David, like Saul, was starting to get caught up in this stuff. The women chanting his name in the streets, that'll do something to a man. The weapons and the warriors and literally an army of soldiers, trained warriors who are all older than him, following him, that'll do something to you. And God said, hold up, let's wipe it all away and remember where we started. God brought David back to the pasture. Because within life's hardest seasons comes God's greatest lessons. Within our hardest seasons comes God's greatest lessons. I remember Peter walking on the water, the storm all around him, and Peter, as much of a bad reputation we give Peter, Peter was actually walking on the water. He was the only disciple to actually get on the boat and do it. And wonderful things were happening until he took his eyes off of Jesus. Until he took his eyes off of the source of his power. I think David started to take his eyes off the source of his victories. And this is what destroyed Saul. God took him back to the pasture. The rest of Psalms 142. David says, then I pray to you, O Lord. I say that you are my place of refuge. You are all that I really want in this life. Hear my cry, for I am very low. Rescue me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of a prison so I can thank you. And I love this part. And the godly will crowd around me, for you are good to me. He said, God, I don't need the kingdom. I need you. He says, I get it, God. I get it now. This is all about you. It's about my relationship with you. You're all that I really want. I don't want the parades. I don't want the fame. I don't want the soldiers. I want you, God. But I need more people to help me. He says, I need the godly to crowd around me. How many of you in your life have been there where you're like, God, I need a real spiritual friend in my life. I need that mentor. I need the godly to come around me and walk through me step by step. And that's his prayer. That's his expectation. And that's not what he gets. See, what we happen is the rest of verse 1 said, David departed from there to escape to the cove of Adullam. And, this is fun, when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. Who showed up? His brothers. Now we know from the past 2 weeks, his brothers were not very fond of David. They didn't support him. They didn't believe that he was called to be the king. Eliab, for one, was jealous that David got the anointing and not him. Verse 2, and on top of that, everybody who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul, what a great group of people, gathered to him. And he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. So he says, God, send me godly people. And David gets his brothers. David gets the people who were in debt, distress, and bitter in soul. And God said, here's your army. Anybody ever been there? Anybody ever been in that place where you were expecting God to come in like a flood, but the person he brought you was not what you had expected? The people of Israel discovered this when they expected the Messiah, the mighty warrior, to show up, and in walks the carpenter's son. See, now these were not great, elite forces that David was looking for, but they were still the people of God. And this is a very important thing to understand. The people of God are not perfect people. We got any perfect people in the room? Other than my wife, she's separate. Any perfect people in the room? Oh, good. This is great. The people of God are not perfect people. We are messed up. What defines people of God as the people of God is simply that they follow the shepherd. They follow the shepherd's voice. That was what Jesus said. The sheep, they know my voice. They're coming after me. The shepherd, who was David, who was Jesus, he would call his sheep. And if a sheep ran the other way, it wasn't my sheep. The sheep followed the shepherd. There are multiple stories of groups of shepherds that would get their herds together. And I love this picture. All these shepherds that come and they mix together. And then when they were all done socializing or eating or whatever they were doing, the shepherds would all go their separate ways and they would call their sheep. And the giant mob of all the mixed sheep would follow the voice of their shepherd. How beautiful that is. Jesus, David here is understanding that these are God's sheep. And you know what? Sheep are smelly. And sheep are dumb. And sheep will walk off a cliff if you don't stop them. And sheep will have no problem wandering off in the night and finding a really nice wolf's cave to lie in for the night. These are sheep. And David remembers sheep. He remembers being the shepherd, and he understands, okay, this is my people. These are the people of God that you have called. Because God will always show his power through imperfect people. If you were perfect, you wouldn't need God. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are poor. Blessed are those who have loss. For God will show his power through imperfect people. See, these men, right now, they're known as the people who are in distress and debt and bitter in soul. But one day history will remember this group of men as David's mighty men. The mighty warrior. Some of them will stand alone before an army of 1,000 and defeat them all. But they started out as a really not bunch of merry men. So then we get to we're going to jump a little bit to chapter 24, because I want to really focus on the patience that David had here. On 1 Samuel chapter 24, starting at verse 1, it said, Then Saul returned from following the Philistines. See, after David had run away, Saul had to go and fight the Philistines. But when that was done, Saul decided to leave the battlefield, to leave fighting the Philistines, and came after David. He was distracted from the call that God had put on his life because he had to satisfy his own need for revenge and vengeance. And when Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men. Oh, here's Israel's elite. There was Saul. 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Hogs Rock. And he came to the sheepfold by the way, where there were caves. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Do I have to explain to you what he was doing here? There was a cave, and he may not have been following the call of God, but he was following the call of nature. And he had to use the restroom. And normal soldiers, they would go out and they would use the restroom in whatever field, but he's the king. And like the leader of North Korea, you can't know that the king actually poops. So he has to go into a cave as he does his business. Now David, this is great. And David and his men were sitting in the innermost part of the cave. You have to understand that out of every cave in all of Israel, they walk into the one cave that David and all of his merry men are hiding in. Then, and the men of David said to him, Here is the day of the Lord, which the Lord said, quote, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. So they quote God here. Now, there's no point in the Bible where we have a record of God speaking through a prophet or God speaking to David and saying this exact line. Now, is it possible that God had said it at some point and we just don't have it recorded? Sure. Is it possible that the men of God, that the men who are following David are taking a verse that they had heard or a prophecy that they had heard and taking it out of context and twisting it to meet their own meaning like we do as human beings? Yes, that's also possible. Is it possible that they're just making it up because it sounds good? Sure. But they sit here and they say, David, this is God's will. This is what God wants you to do. God has delivered you. Look at Saul is sitting here literally on a silver platter. He's offered to you, and God wants you to kill him. David has to make a decision. And then it says, then David arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. So again, we got Saul here, who's probably in the squatting position, for all you people out there. And David creeps up behind him and cuts off the corner of his robe. And then he goes back. And afterward, this is great, David's heart struck him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, little L, the Lord's anointed, big L, and put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. David is saying, I screwed up. This was the Lord's anointed. I wasn't supposed to do this. He said, Saul is not my enemy. Saul is also God's anointed. He said, look, Samuel anointed me. And Samuel also anointed Saul. And he says, God did mighty works through Saul. And Saul just screwed up. Saul is on a prodigal path, but the prodigal son is still a son. The prodigal brother is still a brother. He says, you're not my enemy. Saul belongs to God. And if God chose to anoint him and put him in his position, God is also going to choose to take him out. And that's not my job. But I love how deeply distressed David was over this. He grieves over the fact that he did a little wrong to the man that was hunting him. May our hearts never get so seared that we stop feeling like David felt, where our heart stops breaking. A few days ago, I was talking to Ben Splitgerber, and he said something profound. He said that love is when you hate the things that the other person hates too. That you hate the things that person hates. That you are hurt by the things that also hurt that person. Are we hurt by the things that hurt God? A few days ago, I was talking to somebody in the city, and they were telling me how there's a pastor in town of a larger church, and he had committed a sin. And instead of repenting of his sin, he got up in front of his church and convinced the entire congregation that it was okay, that God wanted him to do this sin. And as I was told this, my heart literally broke. I wasn't angry. It was like my breath got taken away. And for over an hour, I was just struck with grief. All these people who have been so deceived, and now they're going to go and commit that same sin because God said it was okay, because the pastor said that God said it was okay. Now, I could get angry over that. Or I could trust that when God's time is right, God will remove him. Or God will restore him. Either way, that's between him and God. But my heart still broke. And our heart should still break for the things that break hearts, God's heart. So David, I love this part. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. So the men wanted to kill Saul too. Hey, let's get him, David. This is the guy that's put us in this cave. We would be free. You would be king. Everything would be great if we could just kill Saul. And David persuades them with these words not to do it. See, the man of God or the woman of God will follow the will of God. But a leader will persuade others to do so also. David convinced literally an army of really angry people not to kill the bad guy. And he did it, like Psalms 51 says, with a broken and contrite heart. He led with his heart. He led with his compassion. He led with his desire to please God instead of pleasing man. And that's how each of us should lead as well, with a broken and contrite heart. So afterwards, Saul rose up and he left the cave and he went on his way. So Saul leaves, but that's not good enough for David, for the man who was after God's heart. Because it says in verse 8, afterward, David also rose and went out of the cave and called after Saul. He's chasing after Saul. Saul, come back! You understand this? He's running for his life. He says, Saul, come back. He says, my Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. David is humbling himself before the man that's hunting him. What? And David said, Saul, why do you listen to these men, to the words of men who say, behold, David seeks to harm you? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hands in the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. David here understands one very important thing that we have to get. That Saul, nor David, was the king. That Saul nor David was the judge. That God, the Lord over the Lord, the big L, was in charge of this whole thing. And David was much more interested in his right standing with God than him looking cool in front of his friends. David was much more interested in him making himself right with God than letting Saul think that he won. David was more interested in forgiveness for his own sins than for vengeance over Saul's. David was more convicted over his little bad than angry over Saul's big bad. And I want to ask you this morning, how many relationships, how many marriages would be fixed, would be healed if people were seeking forgiveness for their sins instead of vengeance for what the other person did? What would we do if we decided to seek God? I need to make my life right with God, and that other person can figure out how to do it, but I got to make things right with you, God. What would happen? David says, I'm not your enemy, Saul. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand, verses 11. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hurt my life. To take it, you hurt me, Saul. But I'm not going to hurt you back. And I love this. May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge against you, but my hand shall not be against you. David says, I ain't going to do nothing to hurt you. You can do whatever you want to me. And maybe God will bring vengeance, but no matter what, I'm not going to hurt you. And next, Saul apologizes. Saul literally begins to weep and says, David, my son, I am so sorry for what I did. I will never do it again. Please forgive me. And they hug and they make up and everything is great and they all go their way. The problem is that in about 2 chapters, Saul does it again. We have verse 26. Then the Zephites came to Saul at Gilead saying, is David not hiding himself in the hill of something which is on the east of some other place? So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men again to seek David in the wilderness again. And my question to you this morning is, what do you do when the person who apologized to you does it again? What do you do when you have that fight with your spouse and they were wrong and they apologize? Oh, honey, I am so sorry. I will never do it again. And next week, they do it again. What do you do when your child says, Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I will never do that again. Please forgive me. I've learned my lesson. And then the next day, they do it again. What do you do when they do it again? When they hurt you again? What does God do? When you repent of your sins, God, I will never do it again. And then the next Monday, you do it again. Verse 5, and David arose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay. David saw the place where Saul lay. And Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of the army. Saul was lying within the encampment while the army was camped around him. So you have Saul and Abner are together, surrounded by the entire army. Then David said to Ahimelech and to Joab's son Abishai, who will go down with me to the camp of Saul? And Abishai said, I will go with you. Verse 7. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul, sleeping within the encampment, with his spear struck in the ground by his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. So they sneak past the entire army into Saul's camp, and next to Saul's head is a spear sticking in the ground. And Abishai says, David, this is your moment. God has clearly given you a second chance. You screwed up the first time by letting Saul go, but now this is the chance where you get to really take your revenge. God has given Saul into your hands. This is Sister so-and-so when she comes up to you and tells you how, your husband said he was going to do the dishes, and then the next day he didn't do the dishes. You should leave him. You should make him suffer, said sister so-and-so. That's who Abishai is right now, is taking the situation and twisting it to solve their solution. The beauty of this is that God's truth is not subject to popular vote. God's truth is not subject to culture. God's truth is not subject to your difficult personal situation. God's truth is not even subject to time. God's truth is truth. And David here is looking at the situation and saying, whoa, hold up. What was true then is still true now. Now, if David knows that he's not supposed to be doing this, why is God letting him be in these situations? Why is God putting him past the army into Saul's camp with Saul's spear by his head? If this seems like a trap to me, right? God, why are you doing this to David? And I remember, it says that after Jesus was baptized, he was led by the Spirit of God into the desert to be tempted by the devil. And the devil sat there and tempted Jesus. And every single time Jesus turned to the Word of God and said, nope, the Bible said this. Nope, that sounds right, devil. Like, I'm hungry and you bread, yeah, I get it. It sounds good. But the Word of God said this. It doesn't change based on my current situation. It doesn't change based on my hunger. It doesn't change based on our needs. And the devil was trying to get Jesus to claim the kingdom now. If you remember, the devil said, if you bow down and worship me, I will give you everything. I'll give you the whole world, Jesus. Just bow down and worship me. You don't have to die, Jesus. And Abishai is saying, if you just kill Saul now, then we're free. You're going to be the king. I'll be your general. It'll be beautiful. We can take the kingdom now. But in life's hardest situations comes God's greatest lessons. David had to learn to wait. Be patient, David. Wait for the timing of the Lord. David knew that when God was done with Saul, God would take him out. And Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hands this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth. I love Abishai. He's great. Please let me pin him to the earth. With one stroke of the spear, I will not strike him twice. He said, look, I'll do it quick. I'll do it easy. I'll do it quietly. Nobody will even know. He won't make a sound. We'll just pin him to the ground. We'll be done. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him. For who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David believed in God's word. He waited for God's timing. And his priority was his personal integrity. God, I want to be in right standing with you. Even if I never get the kingdom, I want to be in right standing with you. He waited for the promise. He waited a long time for the promise. See, when David was anointed by Samuel in the pasture, it took 20 years. We say that all quick. 20 years of David wandering around the desert with his group of merry men, running away from Saul as Saul constantly hunted him down. Enemy after enemy, scrapping for food out of the wilderness, trying to find a way to survive just till tomorrow. 20 years. And then God's time was up. 1 Samuel 31. Now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in around Saul and his sons, and they killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchishua. The fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, "Take my sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come and run me through and taunt me and torture me." But his armor-bearer was afraid. He would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and killed himself. When his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all of his troops died that same day. God was done. God was judge. God was in complete control. And when God's timing was up, it was over. And so a soldier, in the next chapter we learn that a soldier runs up to David and finds David and says, David, Saul is dead, you're the king. It says that David weeps. Not just for Jonathan, for Saul. God's timing. What did David learn in those 20 years? He learned to depend on God. He learned to be patient for God. He learned how to lead people that were unleadable. He learned how to fight an enemy that was unbeatable. David learned how to be king in the wilderness in his darkest days. 20 years. The horrible thing, the saddest part of all of this was that King Saul was killed by the very people that he was destined to destroy. When God called Saul to be the king, he said, you will defeat the Philistines. Philistines killed him. Because Saul was so focused on killing David, the threat that might take his throne, that he didn't realize the real enemy that was coming after him. Could we get so jealous of those around us, our own family, of our own church, that we fail to see the enemy that's creeping in the back door? I want to invite the worship team to come on up. We're going to sing our last two songs this morning. And I want to leave you with this one verse. James 1, 2 through 4. You know this verse. He says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. It is during those times of waiting that we mature into the kings that God wants us to be. The hero that Israel needed. So I want to open up the altars again this morning. Many of you, I know, you're waiting for things. You're waiting for answers to prayer. You're waiting for healing. You're waiting for that loved one to be saved. And in the meantime, it's difficult. You're waiting for your marriage to be healed. You're waiting for that job, financial blessing to come. You're waiting for the direction of where to go next. And I want to let you know that we're here to pray with you this morning. I'm going to invite the deacons to come on down, and they're going to be here on the altar. And if you need prayer, if you need a moment of encouragement to know that it's not time to take up the sword and kill your Saul, it's time to wait and to grow. So these altars are open. In the meantime, we're just going to sing our